First of all, I want to welcome you here tonight. I really don't know what to say right now. This is an amazing crowd, but I want to say, first of all, that I'm sorry for all the people who are outside, a lot of them being tough students. It was due to a miscalculation, to be honest, from you by the lecture series. We were worried about when we moved from Cohen Auditorium to here whether we would fill this place. I think it's a little obvious. And I just wanted to mention something about the lecture 2 weeks from tonight at Cohen Auditorium. At the end of the summer, we looked over our schedule and speakers and saw that there wasn't too much humor or comedy. And 2 weeks from tonight, Senator Strom Thurmond will be at Cohen Auditorium. I want to turn the program over to the moderator for tonight, which is Professor Hugo Bedau, the chairman of the philosophy department of Tufts. Professor Bedau.
It's, of course, extraordinary to those of us who know our guest tonight that so many of you should have turned out to hear a debate between a man who has been convicted as a notorious saunterer and loiterer with another man who cannot even get himself elected mayor of New York City. No doubt those were not the people, or anyway the descriptions of the people, appropriate to causing you to come here tonight. I think our guests really need no introduction. Professor Howard Zinn of Boston University, to my left. Professor Howard Zinn, as the applause testifies, is familiar to Boston audiences, both from his writings on the war in Vietnam, on civil disobedience, on the struggle against racism in this country, and also from his personal appearances on Boston Common and elsewhere in the community. Mr. William Buckley, to my right, Buckley has a career as a writer and controversialist, perhaps second to none in the United States, and I think it's one well-deserved. From the time as his relatively early youth, he examined his own alma mater, Yale College, for the presence of God and man, and found God absent and man wanting, and subsequently has proceeded to examine with equal dispassion the rest of our institutions in our public life, and has provoked not only mirth but some second thoughts in many quarters. The topic this evening has been announced to you as this: is there a choice between reform and revolution? I suppose that question, among those who give it a bit of thought, provoke various thoughts. I take it the question presupposes that there's a difference between reform and revolution, and we should hope, and I think have reason to expect, that our speakers will discourse on that directly or indirectly. I take it also that the question presupposes that our choice matters, and it'll be interesting to see how their own views show the plausibility or the implausibility of that assumption. But of course it poses choices for different people, and perhaps a greater choice or lesser choice for some than for others. And it may indeed create the possibility of other alternatives which we hope they can set before us. Being experienced controversialists and polemicists both, they have dickered with each other through me with rules for this evening's discussion, and I want to announce them for you as follows. They will make each of them an opening speech of 15 to 20 minutes. Professor Zinn will speak first, then Mr. Buckley will follow. Then each, in that order, will undertake to give a response, what debaters would call a rebuttal, of about 10 minutes each. Then we will have opportunity for questions from the floor, and at that time I will describe somewhat in detail what I'll ignore now, how we shall handle those questions. I point out to your attention now that as I understand it, the only live mic not on the platform is here before me in the center of this floor. And if you're going to want to answer a question, you should courteously, decorously, but nonetheless vigorously, queue up in due course behind that microphone. We're going to have this evening run not all night long. As chairman, I promised to rescue our two guests before the evening goes on intolerably long. This will no doubt distress some of you, but I hope not anger many. In any case, Mr. Buckley and then Mr. Zinn will have a few minutes at the very end to give their final observations on our topic. Is there a choice between reform and revolution? Professor Zinn.
A few nights ago, I decided that I ought to prepare for tonight's encounter. I usually do this by reading a little, thinking a little. I turned on the television. There was a film, The Bridge on the River Kwai, which I considered a kind of good preparation. Some of you saw it, may recall that there are these two men of great principle entangled with one another, fighting with one another, two sides, both sides eminently civilized, one representing the acme of Eastern civilization, presumably, and the other that of Western civilization. And at the end, you see, all through, they have fixed their attention on a bridge, and the bridge becomes the object of the combat. And everything in the world is going to live or die according to that bridge. And so they go at it, both sides, one to build the bridge, another to destroy the bridge. And at the very end, the typical end of a contest between two sides representing the top of civilization, almost everyone is dead. And one survivor, looking around at the corpses strewn all around, says simply, madness, madness. This, it seems to me, represents the state of civilization as we sit here tonight. And the more civilized a society presumes itself to be today, the more madness you find in it.
And no society presumes itself to be more civilized right now in the world than the United States of America, the most literate, the most technologically developed, the most educated, the most powerful, the richest, the most everything. And you look around and you see things that sort of blow your mind and make you wonder about what is sanity. We were reading the other day that 250 square miles of the state of Nevada is covered with radioactive plutonium, which may not mean much. Radioactivity dissipates after a while. They say that plutonium, half of plutonium begins to decay after 24,000 years. Comforting thought. And there was a fire, and they destroyed a lot of plutonium, about $22 million worth of plutonium, enough to build 77 Nagasaki-type bombs, which is, of course, small stuff to us by now. But the Atomic Energy Commission told everyone not to worry. And you know, you can trust the Atomic Energy Commission, just as you can trust most leaders of government, because we were all brought up to know that leaders of government do not lie. It turned out, sadly, the Atomic Energy Commission had lied when they said that there were no significant escapes of this deadly plutonium, and that in fact the incidence of plutonium was very high in the area a few miles from there, like 500 to 300 times as deadly as it should be, and so on. And this goes on and on. You read of nuclear failures, accidents. In 1970, there were 42 accidents in nuclear plants in the world, 37 of them in the United States. All of this is to make us more secure. That's where the madness comes in. In order to make us more secure, we are building more and more bombs. In order to make us more secure, the bombers are flying overhead with H-bombs. In order to make us more secure, we deposited nerve gas in 100,000 six-foot-long rockets, which after a while apparently began to leak. And they had to figure out what to do with them. You remember that remark by one of the top military men involved in the transportation of the nerve gas. He said, really, that you shouldn't worry about it so much. So long, it's true it's deadly stuff. It causes paralysis of the nervous system, you know, a few drops of it. But he said, so long as you can keep breathing, you're all right. You remember a few years ago, as part of our security system, which involves sending H-bombs all over, keeping them around, keeping them in the air, keeping them ready, keeping them poised, we lost a few. Well, we lost 4 of them. One of them for quite a while, which seems kind of careless. And all of this contributing to our security. The problem of security is met by surrounding ourselves, inundating ourselves with deadly weapons. And what we have is this peculiar situation that governments, which supposedly have their first job as protecting the lives of the citizens of the society have become the deadliest enemies of the citizens of the society. That was a crucial word you missed. We've got this worked out, you know, crucial words. So that, you know, we're supposed to worry about, you know, enemies from abroad, enemies who will kill us. And it turns out more and more, as Yossarians saw, that the enemy is whoever wants to get you killed, no matter which side he's on. And when you begin to look at things that way, that the enemy is who wants to get you killed, or who may get you killed out of carelessness, or who may get you killed simply because so many weapons have piled up that you can't control them. When you have this situation, it begins to be hard to tell the difference between Kosygin and Nixon. And then when you see pictures of Nixon shaking hands with Kosygin, or, you know, that kind of across the national boundaries, momentary friendship, and at first you think, oh, what phonies they are, shaking hands with one another and smiling at one another. After a while you think, no, they mean it. They really are friends. They really do have a lot in common with one another, because they both, you see, all these heads of governments, the heads of the Soviet government, the heads of the American government, their interests are the same. Their interests are law and order. Their interests are piling up the weapons. Their interests are preventing revolution in their own land. Their interests are keeping the lid down. Their interests are keeping power. Their interests are keeping things the way they are. And evil cannot be defined anymore by national boundaries. This is that ancient myth, which some people are still, of course, trying to keep alive, that you can tell who's right or wrong, who's good or bad, who should be killed and who should not be killed, by which side of the river he's on, by which side of the boundary he's on, by what language he speaks, by what flag he waves, by what uniform he wears. And we're learning more and more, this is not so. And the madness goes on in Vietnam. We're in Vietnam to save Vietnam. And so we are turning it into a wasteland. We're saving Vietnam by destroying its people, destroying its villages, destroying its village culture, driving 3 million people out of their homes, leaving a land full of amputee children and amputee women and desolated countrysides and denuded forests and malformed children, to the point where the doctors in the hospitals in Saigon and Cholon have to be told to send the records on those children who have been deformed by 2,4,5-T, the chemical dropped by American planes. The doctors are told that where there are births, abnormalities, they have to send those records immediately to the central office in Saigon, where they aren't heard from or seen again. We're doing all this to save the people of Vietnam. What was said about Ben Tre is said about Vietnam. We are destroying this country in order to save it. And the part of the madness of doing all this for freedom, the word comes out of Saigon again and again about the tens of thousands of political prisoners, about the tortures, about the closing of newspapers, about the clubbing and beating of students, about the imprisonment of those students at Saigon University who protest against the war. Another part of the madness, you look around here in this country at who is put in jail and who is not. And if you can tear yourself away, you see, from that set of mind in which we have all been brought up, that the people who are put in jail are criminals and the people who are not put in jail are okay. If you can tear yourself away momentarily from that set of mind and take a look at the quality of people that are put in jail and those who are not, you're struck by some startling, troubling facts. There is George Jackson, the black man in California, put away in Soledad prison, there for 10 years, 7 years in solitary, for a crime which they say he committed, stealing of $70 in a robbery. And there is Senator Russell Long, who collects $150,000 or $200,000 a year in extra money on the oil depletion allowance, which he helped pass in the Senate. And Jackson is in prison, and Long is an important member in the U.S. Senate. Father Daniel Berrigan, a poet, a priest, who committed the terribly violent act of burning draft board records in order to protest the war, is in jail, is in prison, told he mustn't publish his poetry, because there's nothing more dangerous than poetry. While J. Edgar Hoover is free. Now, some high school kid, I think, who was handed a copy of Masters of Deceit by the principal, who was giving them out wholesale to every kid as part of recess, I guess. And the kids covered up the S on Masters of Deceit to indicate his feelings. I said J. Edgar Hoover is free, but I'm not really sure how free he is. I just read where he has just ordered a new armor-plated bulletproof car, which he orders every year. It costs $30,000, the most expensive car, you see, by anybody in the government. And I can see Hoover riding around in this bulletproof armor-plated car. Free? You wonder about the man driving the car and what security checks he had to go through. I'm trying to indicate, of course, by just a few samples, the things are topsy-turvy somehow. In the world, yes, and in this country. And what we call civilization has turned out to be a monstrous caricature of what we thought civilization was when we grew up and played with that word. The other day I was looking at a North Korea newspaper, and it had all these Kim Il-sung everywhere, and I said, those communists. Cult of personality again. Then I turned on the TV that night, and there was Richard Nixon on Channel 4. So I switched to Channel 5. There was Nixon on Channel 5. And there he was on every channel. We call that pluralism. madness, you see, is civilized madness. It's not the way it was in olden times. Well, there was injustice in olden times, there was exploitation in olden times, there was oppression in olden times. This is civilized. What does that mean? That means it's more intense. That means it's greater. That means it's more sophisticated. That means it's done with much more effective technology. That means it's done by gentlemen. That means it's murder committed by men wearing neckties. That means it means that we have these days the mayhem of old magnified 1,000 times, and all presented to us with such elaborate public relations, with public relations men moving all across the country to make this madness palatable to us. That's what civilization has come to mean. It's madness and it's not madness, because there's this kind of scheme to it. It's persistent and it's held together by a set of arrangements which ensure that the same evils are reproduced in ever-magnifying quantities. The profit system. It is more profitable to produce weapons of war than almost anything else. It is more profitable to produce junk than it is to produce useful things. It is more profitable to produce waste. See, we used to produce things that produce waste. Now we produce waste that produces poison. The profit system. The system that is called representative government, which has turned out to be a caricature of what we read about in the textbooks about democracy, which turns out to be oligarchy in disguised form. The system of nationalism, which sends us killing one another periodically, well, no longer periodically, now continually. And because now we have civilization behind murder and madness, now it is institutionalized, now it is organized, now it is carried forward on a mass scale with words, literacy, education, and public relations. And because of that, it will take more than mere reforms to change it. Because of that, it will take, I guess, what we might call revolutionary changes in our society and in other societies in order to begin to get what we might really call civilization. And this means doing away with the profit system as the motive for producing, changing the nature of the economic system so we produce things that people need, not things that will destroy people. Changing the nature of the economic system so we begin to have cooperation instead of the dog-eat-dog that marks our society today. Changing the system from a system of nation-states to an international community where people can move freely across and nobody is your enemy because he lives in another land across some other river. It means changing very fundamental things. It means changing the way we think about one another, men about women, old about young, black about white, white about black. It means changing very fundamental things which none of the previous revolutions managed to change, none of them. That's why we need not only a revolution in the kind of institutions and rules and ways of thinking, we need a revolution in the mode of making a revolution. We need to revolutionize the concept of revolution so it becomes a deeper, more persistent, and more important thing than revolution has ever meant. This means a more long-term process of changing the way people live. It means initially resisting the state, resisting the public relations men who speak and apologize for the state. It means beginning to build new forms of cooperative societies on small scale, decentralized within the old society. It means changing the way we think about one another and changing the way we think about other people in the world. That's the kind of revolution I'm talking about. I guess it's a kind of revolution that would have to be a permanent revolution in order to keep up with the incredible pace of change and the incredible momentum of evil that we find everywhere in the world. I think my time is up, and I think I ought to stop.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, Professor Zinn, I'm glad to be here, I guess. And grateful to you for your patience so far. I did find it a little bit strange that Mr. Danny Goldberg, who has been so very kind to me during the last 2 hours, should have bothered to invite Senator Thurmond to address those students at Tufts who want to listen to him, and then having sort of ambushed him here tonight by saying that he was sure the time had come for you to listen to a comedian. Perhaps that's the way one defines academic freedom at Tufts. I'd like to think not, but I do want to tell Mr. Goldberg, because I wouldn't want to be involved in any misrepresentations, and I guess I may as well tell you while I'm at it, that I would very enthusiastically, had I been a member of the Senate during the past 15 years, voted about 95% of the time with Senator Thurmond on all major issues. Now, perhaps, yeah, that's what I was hoping for. So in other words, I don't want you... So therefore, I'm extremely anxious that in the event Mr. Goldberg forgot to tell you a week ago that he had invited me here in order for you to enjoy my comic positions, that you should have an opportunity to adjust yourself to them, which opportunity I have now given you. Now, I listened with interest to Professor Zinn's catalog of horrors. We were supposed to debate the relative merits of revolution and reform, a subject which he arrived at 24 minutes after he began and disposed of 25 minutes after he began. He seemed to think that this audience would prefer for him to hobgoblinize the history of the United States, which he is allegedly professionally qualified to talk to us about, as a result of which he made a number of comparisons, presumably in an effort to edify. But it seems to me that before one gets down to a discussion of the relative merits of reform and revolution, one ought, in that scientific interest which Mr. Zinn celebrates in the prefaces to all of his books, attempt to examine some of the statements which he made, which some of you seem to have greeted rather gladly. It has always surprised me how many people are especially glad if they are reassured how awful America in fact is. I have a feeling that some people, if it were, for instance, proved, let's say, beyond shadow of a doubt, that in fact Robert Jackson hadn't robbed $70, George Jackson, or that in fact his real name was Robert. And that in fact he was the underground leader of the Ku Klux Klan, there would be rather a considerable disappointment, because it does give some people so much pleasure to assume that there is even more injustice than they are able to put their fingers on, for instance. We have Mr. Zinn making some rather facile comparisons between Mr. Jackson and Russell Long. Russell Long, said he, for instance, is receiving, I think he put it, $200,000 or $300,000 worth of money as a result of the oil depreciation allowances which he helped to pass, presumably at age 20, which is how old he was when that particular law was passed. At the suggestion of a commission appointed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. By the same token, I suppose, if one wanted to argue the merits of revolution versus reform, one should say, look at him. Look at him. He teaches at a university that's tax deductible, tax exempt. Anybody who gives money to this university gets a much larger deduction than he gets by investing in oil stocks. Did you know that? Well, the answer is he does. Depending on your bracket, it can go this year as high as a 58% deduction if you give money to Taft. Who gets the benefits of it? In part, Mr. Zinn. I suppose if one wanted to personalize this argument in the style of Mr. Zinn, I would say, you know, it seems to me he's getting an enormous salary given the amount of time that he spends on his books and the amount of time he spends in his classes, enormous summer vacations. Does Strom Thurmond get that long a summer vacation? My Lord, he was working up until Christmas Eve. And so were people... Yes, he was, yeah. So, yes, he was. Now, it may be that sharing some of my prejudices about government, which I wrote about 25 years ago, you would join me in wishing that Congress would convene after about 3.5 days, which I would consider an ideal session. But in point of fact, if one is going to say that public policy results in certain opportunities which other people feed on, the answer is, of course, that Mr. Zinn is one of the greatest exploiters in America. Not only is he advocating certain points of view, he is doing so in an auditorium which was built in part with tax-deductible money. He is, in fact, engaging, as he so proudly proclaims himself to be doing, he is engaging from this pad in the course of trying to preach that same revolution, which, he says, Mr. Nixon and J. Edgar Hoover are bound and determined shall not come to pass. The trouble is, of course, that way a madness surely lies. It seems to me that the significance of the imprisonment of Father Berrigan is that, in fact, we do make attempts in America at impartial justice. Or shall we say that no poet shall be jailed ever? Is that what it is that we're trying to suggest? If a law is passed, I know of no significance of that law, other than that it should apply impartially to Father Berrigan or to Robert Jackson, George Jackson. And it seems to me under the circumstances that it says something about the United States, however wicked we want it to be, that people like Father Berrigan are handed impartial justice. But it seems to me that these distinctions seem to be lost on Mr. Zinn and on other people. He says that Richard Nixon welcomes, above all things, the opportunity to see to it that we do not revolutionize, that he shall not lose power. But in fact, he did lose power. He lost an election to John Kennedy, and he lost another one to Pat Brown 2 years later. And he started from where he was and reached to the position where he now is, having to fight for the approbation not of the Politburo, not of the military-industrial complex, but of people like you and like me. He won every primary election that he ever engaged in. It seems to me wrong for us to say that Gene McCarthy showed that there is still democracy and freedom in the United States because he won primaries, but that when Richard Nixon wins primaries, that proves nothing at all. The trouble is that demonology is such an intellectually slovenly way to go about arguments. It is, of course, the argument of those who are intellectually bankrupt. That it becomes a great deal easier to proceed by begging people to believe in the bad motives of people that we are opposed to. Mr. Nixon's very convenient for this. In the first place, he's kind of square, and everybody knows it. John Kennedy is a little bit less easy to handle in this way, especially, I suppose, in Massachusetts, which has a considerable affection for him, which is shared by people in other parts of the country. Mr. Kennedy beat Mr. Nixon by saying there was a thing called a missile gap, that we needed to spend more money on these tools and weapons of war, that Mr. Zinn is here to tell us are precisely indices of our civilizational decrepitude. He, having become President of the United States, gave the only ultimatum that has been given, so far as we know, to the Soviet Union during the past 10 years. I happen to think, along with Arthur Schlesinger, along with Mr. Galbraith, that this was a high moment of statesmanship in 1962. Now, if it had been Nixon who did it, I agree it would be much harder to say this. There would be sort of these instinctive boos, how can you say that a Nixon of this world could possibly have been responsible for an act of statecraft. You do understand what I'm trying to say, which is that it depends who it is that you summon. And therefore, when he wants to say that there are really no significant differences between the Soviet Union and the United States, he talks about Kosygin and Nixon as being more or less the same, without bothering to stress what? Without bothering to stress that Kosygin is completely unknown in the Soviet Union before the hagiolatry began. He was somebody who worked his way up through a tight power struggle. The people of the Soviet Union don't know who he is, but there he is, and he's there until he is kicked out. Mr. Nixon is there until you kick him out. Perhaps you will choose to do so. That certainly is your right. It is not your right to pretend that you don't have the power to kick him out. Tell that to LBJ. He was kicked out, and this is an example of reform, if you like, operating. We don't have to agree in what direction we should move in order to be able to agree on at least this proposition that we have moved. We have moved in significant directions, and that the only way we can understand intelligent arguments about whether we should move or in what direction we should move, we should at least make unanimously a decision that we will continue to despise people who cannot tell the difference between the quality of life here and the quality of life in the Soviet Union. If it makes some of you feel any better at all, the answer is that dissatisfaction with one's own lot is something that has been known throughout history. It was 10% of the population of Cuba has left it since Cuba went over to the revolutionists who wanted to disdain the profit motive and bring us the kind of society that Mr. Zinn celebrates. It was 52 years ago that the Soviet Union did away with the profit motive. Have they done away with the military-industrial complex? We are spending 9% of our gross national product, less than we spent under Harry Truman on the defense. The Soviet Union is spending 21% of its gross national product. The Soviet Union has 55% of the people working on the soil to produce what? Food? Every third word in Mr. Zinn's books is food. To produce not quite enough food for the people of the Soviet Union. 88% of the people in China are engaged in producing food for themselves and for the other 12. In Japan, which does not despise the profit motive, which has a certain amount of political freedom, the gross national product divided in individual terms is $1,800. In Formosa, which also encourages economic freedom, which had a redistribution of the land and agricultural redistribution during the middle 50s, it is $800. In China, it is $80. What is it Mr. Zinn wants? Certainly he doesn't want what the people in those lands want, because what do we know about the people in those lands? If you are a resident of the Soviet Union, the answer is you can't leave. Not the country. The town you live in, you can't leave, let alone the country. If you're in Cuba, 10% of the people have crawled out of that. 10%, the equivalent of 20 million people fleeing the United States, not the 1,102 people who have fled to avoid the draft. Why did they need a Berlin Wall if Mr. Zinn, having abolished the private motives, knows how we will reach a state of eudaimonia, which exquisitely shines through his fevered rhetoric? The answer is, of course, we're not going to have a revolution in this country unless you use the word as a metaphor. And the reason you're not going to have it is because people don't want it. Now, you may say the people are blind, stupid, dumb, perverted, misled, and I suspect that that is what a great many people think. I largely agree. And the reason I largely agree is because it seems to me that there is more patience than I would like to see in an ideal society towards people who make their living by calumniating that society. By that I mean something very careful. I don't intend, even if assuming I had the power to do so, to take this gentleman up on the wall and call the executioners. But I do think that Mr. Zinn occasionally ought to be reminded in the course of his fantasies about revolutions that counter-revolutionists have certain powers too. Dr. Johnson put it rather acidly when he said, nothing concentrates the mind so wonderfully as the knowledge that you're going to be hanged in 2 weeks. Now, I don't think the time has come to hang Mr. Zinn. I definitely think that the time would come if it became obvious that he was threatening the livelihood or the freedom of other people. But I do say that the overwhelming majority of the American people, however much patience, however much indulgence they show to people who can actually compare a Nixon or a John F. Kennedy with a Kosygin, or a J. Edgar Hoover with the chief of the secret police in the Soviet Union, that these people are showing a rather remarkable indulgence which may just possibly elide into that kind of slovenliness which is a prelude to the dissolution of society. So I'm here to say it is not likely that many people in this room will find or could construct a greater catalog of grievances against this society than I do as a member, I suppose, of a smaller minority than anyone here in this room, as someone who has never voted enthusiastically for any president of the United States except once. But I do say this, that one ought to know enough about the temper of the American people to know that they will reject anarchy, as almost every society has. Every society prefers despotism to anarchy, and no society enjoys a despotism. This is a conclusion, a historical conclusion, that has been time and time again demonstrated by such as Mr. Toynbee, who loathes America and is perfectly willing to say so. But it is a conclusion the consequences of which are not sufficiently considered. Because the consequences of it are that if, in fact, revolutionists grow in this country, reject the Constitution, reject reform, reject the kind of progress that we know from historical experience can be had, whether it is reducing the amount of money that is spent on defense, or whether it is increasing the number of people who are educated, whether it is increasing the economic lot of the Negro, whether it is decreasing in absolute dollars the amount of poverty from 50% at the turn of the century to 11% today, those who reject reform in favor of revolution do not sufficiently consider the rights of the counter-revolutionists. Those rights of the counter-revolutionists can be electric and can be cold and purposeful. It was never suggested by Edmund Burke that King George III didn't have a right to go and to try to keep George Washington from having his way. And if in fact he had apprehended George Washington and hanged him publicly, there are those who would have deplored royal punctilio, but nobody at all who would have felt that there was any appeal available to George Washington. No greater appeal than had been available to Vercingetorix to use against Julius Caesar. So remember the rights of the counter-revolutionists. Remember that we are a society in very continuous motion. A society in which people who are satisfied less with the kind of self-flagellatory rhetoric that Mr. Zinn so much enjoys, more with actually trying to do something to somebody, can, having got over the necessity of comparing the John F. Kennedys with the Cossegans in this world, try to make a genuine contribution to social improvement.
While Mr. Buckley recovers his breath, we will turn our attention, and I assume he will too, to such remarks by way of rejoinder as Professor Zinn now feels himself ready to deliver.
I guess if Mr. Buckley did not exist, the establishment would have to invent him. Maybe they did. It's possible that they took a good look at J. Edgar Hoover and decided that he did not have sufficient humor. I don't know where they got that idea. They probably tested him out, sent him to a Marx Brothers picture, and found him taking notes. But Mr. Buckley shares, and I say this not, listening to him and listening, I think he shares the sentiments of J. Edgar Hoover, but he presents the ideas more tolerably. He shares the sentiments, as he himself said, at least 95% of Strom Thurmond, but is much more personable. And we haven't had anyone in this country who so charmingly presents the case for Chiang Kai-shek, South Africa, the Greek dictatorship, the White South. we also hardly have anyone who more deftly avoids an issue. You see? He deals with the question of oil depletion allowances for oil companies by bringing in universities and faculty salaries, the assumption being that a university and an oil industry are to be treated exactly the same way. Now, maybe sometimes they should be, but I kind of think there's a difference. I also suggest that, to say that, we're asking amnesty for all poets from all crimes does not quite meet the issue presented by the jailing of Father Berrigan. And to suggest that Father Berrigan is simply being given equal justice before the law is to ignore the number of times that the federal government does not prosecute people who commit violence against human beings. You see, to say that there is equal justice before the law and that Father Berrigan is the recipient of it is to show a great deal of ignorance about the workings of the FBI and the forces of law and order in this country. Because when I was living and working in the South and was involved in civil rights activities and saw the workings of the FBI, became very evident that there were people who committed violence in the sight of the FBI against other human beings. There were white sheriffs who broke federal law and who beat and who electric prodded and who took blacks into custody and knocked them to the ground with clubs, violating federal law each time, and the FBI stood by and took notes and did nothing. And these men were not prosecuted. The law operates in different ways for different people. And if Mr. Buckley does not know that, he does not know a very basic fact about American society. It's a very important thing to know, because if you don't know that, you begin to deify the law. And the law is not made by gods. It's made by Strom Thurmond. Also, the bringing in, the Kennedy did the same things even more than Nixon did with the arms race. It's true. Kennedy spent $9 billion more than Nixon. And then McCarthy, and comparing McCarthy and Nixon. I don't know how relevant this is to my argument, which I presume Mr. Buckley was trying to respond to. If you read perhaps some of the prefaces of my book, and I don't blame him for not reading any further, but if he had read any further, he would have seen that I criticized Kennedy the way I criticized Nixon, and that the electoral system which produced the McCarthy is as ineffectual to me as the electoral system which produced the Richard Nixon. It is also evading the issue to answer criticism of the United States by talking about the quality of life in the Soviet Union. You see, it's as if Mr. Buckley has not learned anything in 20 years. You see, in the 1950s, and we all kind of, in the 1950s, this was accepted. If anybody criticized the United States, you said, what about the Soviet Union? Now, if there's anything that we have begun to learn in the last 6 or 10 years, and if there's any spirit which seems to me is positive and creative and fresh in what there is of the left or the movement in the United States, it's the understanding that the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries of the world do not represent the model for the United States, that there is no model, that all of these governments are subject to criticism, that the way of life in all of these countries is something that needs to be examined and re-examined. And you can't take a society which is dedicated, as our society is now, so much to death, the death of its own men and the death of other people, and excuse it and wipe it away by talking about the iniquities of other societies. If Mr. Buckley believes anything about totalitarian states, he believes we ought to support totalitarian states so long as they're anti-communist totalitarians rather than communist totalitarians. His test is not liberty or autocracy. His test is not totalitarianism or democracy. His test is communism or anti-communism. It's the test of George Orwell's Animal Farm. You decide who an enemy is by whether he walks on 2 legs or 4 legs. You've lost sight of the final humane considerations that a man should have. I read recently where Mr. Buckley was objecting to the no-knock laws. I'm sorry, he was he was objecting to the objections to the no-knock laws because he seems to think that police have up to this point been too shy in entering people's apartments. You see, this is another indication Mr. Buckley has not lived in this world. He's lived a very sheltered life. His apartment has never been invaded by the police. He has never been taken off to jail and clubbed, you see. In this particular argument that I saw where he was defending the no-knock law, he said, well, you know, people might flush heroin down the toilet. The big toilet flushing hang up there. And it's really nothing to worry about. You see, not really. Even if you think about it, that really won't deter the police or the FBI. If they can tap wires, they can tap toilets. Anyway, we need to get away from all brands of totalitarian thinking about law and order and punishing those people who deviate. Thank you.
I'm beginning to feel like a referee at a basketball game telling you it's now time for the second overtime. Mr. Buckley, your response.
Mr. Chairman, it's quite true that I haven't been victimized by any criminal, and to that extent I offer myself to the crowd as a statistical oddity. During the 10 years that Mr. Zinn has been devoting to describing America as a society dedicated to death. Between 1959 and 1969, crime rate has gone up. For instance, murder, 14,500 last year, as opposed to 8,000 10 years ago. Now, I'm in favor of doing something about it. And if Mr. Zinn presumably is, assuming that the wrong people are being murdered, I leave it to him to suggest what it is that's appropriate. I simply resisted on the occasion that he recalls. I simply resisted the notion that people who passed the no-knock law, including 90% of the Democrats in the Congress of the United States, were necessarily fascinated by the possibilities of destroying American freedom. And I did point out that they had a no-knock law in England, and that they don't have a slave state in England. So the statistics are there and are repetitious, and the answer is, of course, that we haven't discovered what to do about crime, and that we've got to experiment with different ways of trying to find something to do about it. But I know of no way more decisive of defeating somebody's freedom in this country than, for instance, killing. And the answer is, of course, that we do have to encourage the forces of law and order, to use Mr. Zinn's term, sufficiently to guarantee the freedom of people who don't want to be burglarized, don't want to be killed. Now, on the matter of my own foreign policy, which Mr. Zinn wants to make a subject of this debate, let me say that I agree 100% with the formulation of William Fulbright. His formulation is that however noxious the internal political system of any country in the world, the United States foreign policy ought not to be concerned with it except to the extent that that country seeks to export it. I know of no efforts, for instance, of Papa Doc to export his philosophy in the Caribbean, but I do know of efforts by Fidel Castro to export it. And under the circumstances, it strikes me that it makes sense to describe a different foreign policy towards Castro and towards Papa Doc, though as between the two, of course, there is nothing morally to be said. But let's get back just for one moment to what I consider to be a paralyzing problem that Mr. Zinn has. In effect, he says, I'm for freedom, and therefore we shouldn't fight. This society, says he, is dedicated to death. Now, the figures don't particularly interest him, and may not interest all of you, but they are figures which I nevertheless presume to give you. We have suffered dead in Vietnam in 7 years, fewer people than we suffer dead on the highways of this country every year. This is an argument. This is an argument intending to say only a single thing, namely, that if in fact it is our intention to construct a hierarchy of values which minimizes statistically the chances of death, the automobile is the greatest local weapon, certainly a greater weapon than that stretch in Nevada which keeps Mr. Zinn sleepless at night. Secondly, I deny that it is impossible to accomplish idealistic corporate enterprises through war. War must, at almost any cost, in my judgment, be avoided. But I do not deny the idealism of people who went to war against Adolf Hitler. I do not deny that part of the idealism that made the Civil War, that gave it an abolitionist objective. As regards these sacrifices which call for revolution now, it was recently revealed by a statistician that in America between 1961 and 1965, men between the ages of 20 and 41, out of 5 of them were killed in the Civil War. What is the purpose of this except to ask for historical perspective? Because if you don't have historical perspective, you may as well simply retreat to utopia and have your arguments there. But what's the point? We'd all agree. The death is to be shunned, the death is to be deplored, the death is a tragedy. We don't live in utopia. We live in a world in which we have seen that a certain rather edgy stability has survived during the nuclear age because some people have guts. I mean the Winston Churchills of this world, and I mean the John F. Kennedys of this world. And I say that nothing is more certain than that the kind of human misery which nobody in this room has ever conceived of would sweep over the world if we were to ever to indulge for one moment the lunacies of Professor Zinn. I say that knowing that the formulation is calculated to antagonize you, because I'm not here to be unctuous or ingratiating. I'll merely tell you that history is utterly unobliging to the despicable thesis that ours is a society dedicated to death. How can we be dedicated to death in a society which has done as much as this society has done to avoid war? A society that has lived, a society which makes it possible for you to be here today, precisely because you have what? Those people who feel that war is something which can simply be excreted from the social system by a mere act of volition, are children. And the trouble with turning over on foreign policy to children is that what then happens is real holocausts, the kind of death that resulted in the ravaging of Russia and Hitler,
and of the continent of Europe as a result of a failure of statecraft. I say that anybody who wants less to indulge the masochistic rhetoric which is so fashionable in American colleges and actually open a history book for long enough to find out will recognize that there have been fewer deaths by war, fewer deaths of American citizens in the last 25 years than at any time in human history. And that is as a result of the fact that we are willing to assert our will and willing to avoid the temptations which unfortunately were not avoided by the statesmen of Europe who presided on the eve of that great Holocaust.
I'd like now to take the first question, please. Would you please address it to Mr. Buckley or Mr. Zinn?
I address this question to Mr. Buckley. And I wish to announce in the interest of the profit motive that I also work for the Phoenix, so that there's a certain common ground. The second thing I want to say, though, is that what I would like Mr. Buckley to pay attention to, and what he ignored in Mr. Zinn, I would like him to reply to Mr. Zinn's comments on the operation of the FBI in the South. And the reason I'd like him to do this is I was shot at in Georgia this summer, and the FBI was not interested in who shot at me, but they were very interested in who I worked for and why I should be in Georgia trying to find out what's going on, and they were very interested in helping a local sheriff in Lee County. Now, Mr. Buckley, would you say something to what Mr. Zinn said about the fact that law does not protect or apply to black people in the South the way you somehow, in your utopia, seem to think it does?
Well, if I were the FBI, I would also have asked you why you were shot at. I don't even know why you were shot at. Presumably you would have told me if you thought it relevant. The answer is, of course, that a great many people, as I mentioned a moment ago, don't get apprehended and tried and convicted. Whether that's the FBI's fault or other people's fault is something that I'd be glad to argue about. It is true that during the period when there's been almost a doubling of people who have been killed, not just wounded like yourself, there have been a series of Supreme Court decisions which are interpreted by some people as crippling to the liberties of people who are victimized by the criminal element. It is also true that at the turn of the century there was an average of 300 lynchings per year in the South, and that there have not been, thank God, more than a half dozen during the past 4 or 5 years. I consider that to be progress. Now, if it's your point that FBI agents are trained to enjoy the spectacle of your being shot, I would say that they are being trained badly, because if they're at it, while they're at it, why don't they see that you perish? So under the circumstances, it seems to me that you have to come up with a more plausible explanation of why the FBI is delinquent in its duty to protect you.
Yeah. Can I say?
Sure, by all means.
I suppose I don't have to point out that Mr. Buckley hasn't answered the question. Which I would like to try to do. It's not just that the FBI is sloppy about apprehending criminals, although it may be from time to time. This is not a matter of sloppiness. It does matter to the FBI if you are black or white, and it does matter to the FBI if you have long hair or not, or if you work for the Phoenix, or who you don't work, or whether you're a radical or not. That matters very much to the FBI, and you can tell this by the systematic way in which the FBI operated in the South to protect people who committed violence against black people and against civil rights workers, both black and white. Systematically. When something is done systematically, it's not a matter of sloppiness. It's not just a general matter of not being very efficient. The FBI has been very efficient at getting bank robbers and very inefficient systematically at getting people who killed or beat up blacks. And you cannot meet the question by talking about how many lynchings there were in the old days. Mr. Buckley's constant answer to the problem of mayhem and injustice is to say, well, there was a time when it was worse, or there is a place where it is worse. And I suppose the object of that is to make us feel that we're all very lucky indeed, and blacks in the South should feel really lucky that not so many of them are being lynched today, that they are just in danger of being lynched.
A question, please, for Mr. Zinn, and then Mr. Buckley will respond if he wishes.
Oh, okay, sorry. The topic was supposed to be reform and revolution, and neither of you, I don't think, have spoken very much about. You mentioned something about reform. I think it was basically a waste. And you were not specific about what you meant about revolution. And this, I think, means are very, very important. I don't think the end in sight, and this is what I want to ask in specific. What do you feel about nonviolent revolution? Specifically nonviolent resistance, nonviolent non-cooperation, nonviolent intervention as means of revolutionary change?
The reason it's very hard to talk about the mode of revolution in the United States is I think we're faced with a situation that is different than situations in other countries where there have been revolutions, or situations in other countries today where you have very clear demarcations, you see, between a very small aristocratic elite and a very large landed mass and so on. We have a very sophisticated society with a very complex set of controls, which Madison foresaw in Federalist Number 10 by setting up a kind of government which would make it very difficult for people to make very basic changes. We're dealing with a government which has a defense in depth. That's what balance of power means. That's what division of power means between the various branches of government. We're dealing with a system which is sophisticated enough to persuade people to internalize the values of the system. Now, this means, therefore, that in order to make revolutionary, radical, deep-seated changes in the profit system, in the political system, in the way people think, a coup d'etat, a palace revolution, a violent seizure of power, the traditional guerrilla warfare is not going to do in the United States. And just as a pragmatic matter, it seems to me that those modes of operation, which are mostly nonviolent, and which are long-term, which involve organizing people, creating clusters of power wherever we can in a society, operating, yes, as guerrillas, but not as military guerrillas, as political and cultural guerrillas. We're up against enormous centralized power. We're up against an FBI which has agents at every meeting like this. We're up against police forces that take pictures of everybody at a demonstration in this free and democratic state. And the problem, therefore, is not to amass your force to take the White House. You're not going to be able to do it. We don't have a Winter Palace. In fact, Nixon, moves around from motel to motel. You'd have to get the whole Howard Johnson's chain. And our problem is our revolution. What the revolution means to me in the United States is not a quick violent seizure of power, but long-range organizing activity in which you organize pockets of resistance among people everywhere in the country, yes, in universities, in communities, in places where people work, to the point where young people can resist going to war, to the point where people in factories can stop working when they think the policies are going against them, where we can stop General Motors from turning out pollution into the air, where we can stop the oil companies simply by stopping the machinery of government. Now, This means resistance. It may mean disorder in the way that strikes and demonstrations and nonviolent resistance very often means disorder. But I think it will take a succession of acts like that, long run, but not as long run as the slow, endless, and impossible process of reform which we've had so far in the United States, and which hasn't changed anything basic in the economy or in the polity or in the culture.
The question for Mr. Buckley, to which Mr. Zinn has just addressed himself, is the relation between revolution and nonviolent, non-cooperation, nonviolent resistance, and so forth. Mr. Buckley.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, leading up to that question, I want to make one more stab at the matter of the FBI, because I dissatisfied the gentleman from Phoenix, and I take it a few others. Mr. Zinn says that there's probably an agent of the FBI in this room. Well, it seems to me that that we must simply assume from the burden of the objections that there ought at least to be one FBI in this room, since we are holding the FBI responsible for all of the crimes that have been perpetrated throughout the country. Now, I think I have a paralyzing suspicion that I have to inform a few members of this audience that the FBI is not that they are not policemen, that they don't have the responsibilities of sheriffs or policemen. They are a fact-finding agency. I have a second suspicion that I also have to inform some people who didn't know it, that they have absolutely no jurisdiction whatsoever to look into any crime which is not a federal crime. I don't blame the FBI, I blame the Constitution. That's the way it was written. Under the circumstances, a great many of the crimes that were committed in the South and elsewhere don't fall under the jurisdiction of the FBI. Now, on the assumption, which apparently gives special satisfaction to some members of this audience, that black people are the particular victims we now have to desert the FBI, if you don't mind, because, as I say, they're not going into this kind of thing, but police brutality. The answer is, of course, I don't think it's so. At least the students of Columbia University don't think it's so. They say that it was the white people who suffered primarily during the bust of 1968. Certainly in Chicago they don't think it's so. There were very few black people there in 1968, so all of the police brutality was done primarily against white people. Or you take Haight-Ashbury, you have a situation there in which it was alleged that the police brutality was committed primarily against white people. So, if we can just unscramble that, for the record, the FBI is not who it is that you should have your nightmares about in this particular instance. It's police, just general police. Number two, don't disregard the complaints of white people who insist that they are sometimes not only equally victimized, but sometimes singled out. Now, just briefly, the answer is, of course, that there are many modes by which revolution is achieved. We know about the whole philosophy of satyagraha as practiced by Gandhi, and we know that nonviolent revolution, in fact, can and has worked. But I know of no case in which it has worked without the acquiescence of the overwhelming majority of the people. I know where revolutions have worked through violence, representing the wishes of only a relatively small minority of the people, because it is possible to intimidate. But where you want to affect revolution or counter-revolution, you've got to have the overwhelming majority of the people, as Gandhi had in India. And under the circumstances, it seems to me of only platonic interest as regards the United States.
A question, please, for Mr. Buckley. Yes. You're not being heard. Can we have that mic on, please?
Hello. This is... Sure, I will. This is a question directed to Mr. Buckley, and as I remember, Mr. Zinn said, pointing faults at others is no excuse to hide your own faults, which not only Mr. Buckley avoided answering, but he reasserted it by taking up examples like Kennedy spending $9 billion or death on highways, more than the death in Vietnam. Now, at this point, I would like to ask Mr. Buckley, at first place, why are you so reluctant to accept the facts which are, to me or to my friends, more or less so obvious. Now, they may not be the absolute fact, but as they stand, even as a partial facts, why do you tend to omit accepting them? At the second place, isn't it a good point to stop thinking about history or blame historians and realize what is wrong with the society and do something to change it, rather than blame Kennedy or Nixon or whatever it is?
But the answer is, of course, that you are mostly wrong. Not altogether, but mostly. Very often you do account for that which you don't like as a result of other people's faults. I'll give you an example. I don't think we'd be spending $50-60 billion a year unless it was necessary at the margin to protect ourselves against somebody not only who has nuclear weapons and international missilery, but against a country which has shown itself absolutely disposed to colonize other countries of the world and to go generation after generation without free elections. Now, for instance, what is it that we would do otherwise? If there were no nuclear bombs anywhere else in the world, I would certainly vote for dumping ours. But sometimes we need all this stuff. For instance, I remember reading communiques written by the head of your government, at least the head of the Indian government, beseeching President Kennedy to please deliver sufficient hardware for you to fight off the communist Chinese in 1962. Frantic cables from John Kenneth Galbraith, for God's sakes. I'm very glad we provided the help. But if we had gone ditching everything into Lake Tahoe, wherever Mr. Zinn wants to put it, the answer is that you wouldn't have been free to leave your country by now.
Professor Zinn, do you wish to comment?
I'm going to take a little of the same liberty that Mr. Buckley did to answer a previous question. Just a correction of fact about the FBI. The FBI is not just an information gathering agency. It is a police agency. Its job is to enforce federal law, and not just to gather facts. Its job is to arrest people and put them away like local policemen do. And it does this from time to time, except in those cases when it chooses not to do so. And if you will look up, Mr. Buckley, Section 3052, Title 10 of the U.S. Code, you will find the specific power of the FBI to make arrests in cases where federal law is violated. If you look up federal law, Section 242, Title 18, you will find that it is a violation of federal law for anybody to deprive anybody, to conspire to deprive anybody of its constitutional rights. This brings police brutality and instances like that within the purview of federal law, the federal government, and the FBI, a purview which they have so far failed to recognize. The other point on the matter of we need all these arms because the Soviet Union is colonizing other countries, and also, strangely enough, because they've had generation after generation of non-free elections. This is very shortly after Mr. Buckley's told us he subscribes to Mr. Fulbright's notion that we don't concern ourselves with the internal affairs of other countries, only with, what they do externally. And now he's worried about the free elections in the Soviet Union. I also am worried about the free elections in the Soviet Union, but I don't see how pertinent that is to Mr. Buckley's point or to the business of raising arms in piles against them, because if that was so, then we would need to raise arms against just about every country that Mr. Buckley has at various times espoused and supported in the course of his political career, countries that have not had free elections. The Saigon government being a very good example of it. I just recall as one swift example of a free election. In 1955, the Zinn regime, which had been put into power in Vietnam by the United States after they took Mr. Zinn out of New Jersey and deposited him in Vietnam, held an election in which Mr. Zinn ran against Bao Dai, and in this election, Mr. Zinn received something like 600,000 votes in the city of Saigon. The trouble is there are only 450,000 registered voters. and you can multiply this to the election of 1967. You can talk about it. Anyway, the point about free elections somehow is thrown in as a neat aside because it's an easy thing to do. And I think we would need to do a lot more to justify the devotion of the major part of this country's governmental resources to stockpiling enough arms to demolish every major Soviet city 40 times.
Question, please, for Professor Zinn.
I don't know if this has been asked before, but try it anyway. I'm very interested in points that was made before to Mr. Buckley about the war and stuff like that. So I want him to answer this too. What I'm wondering is that. Okay, I'm trying. What I'm wondering is, given the situation that there is war, and most of the time it's very bitchy and heinous, and that all the time anyway, we probably will have conflicts until the sun stops moving and stuff like that. We've got to try and find ways of having conflict without guns and that kind of stuff. And I was wondering if either of you have heard of non-violent civil defense as a means of raising an army, and what you think of it, and why, if this, in this part for Buckley, why, if you think, why, if tactics for this are made possible, would you think that people advocating this should have control of foreign policy? I haven't formulated it right, but I want
to answer that question quickly, I think it would be a good idea if advocates of nonviolent civil defense were in power in every country.
Yes, I think that it is a perfectly serious point. Does sort of participatory civil defense work? And the answer is it does under certain circumstances when there is a completely congenial terrain and a considerable determination among the overwhelming majority of the people. Unfortunately, I think that it tends to work only when there is a prospect of ultimate victory. An example would be, say, in Yugoslavia, which did engage in that kind of self-defense and held out in 61, 50, in 41, 42, 43, but there were always other nations there contributing to the defense of the civil population, trying to help them in their exertions, and there was the prospect of victory, which, for instance, didn't exist in Tibet, and of course didn't exist in Hungary, which is why I think in some situations it works, and in some it doesn't.
Mr. Buckley, a question for Mr. Buckley.
Let's see, 60% of the budget is allocated to the military, only 24% is allocated to health, education, and welfare. That means that war is like over 2.5 times more important to our government than the health, education, and welfare of the people. That's absurd. Furthermore,
Could you ask your question, please?
Okay, this is my question now. 15% of the gross national product is war and war-related spending. As a result of the multiplier effect, if you were to cut it out initially, it would reduce employment, production, wages all by 60%. That's, economic chaos, depression, economic revolution. The only way to avoid this, I guess, is to have legislation to swiftly reallocate funding from the military to pollution control, etc. But with the lobbies, this is impossible. It seems to me that
We still haven't the question.
Okay, it
Could
seems
you
to me that the
please?
lobbies are preventing viable change and making revolution the only means of change. Now, how are you going to deal with the lobbies in order to get needed social reform put through and hence avoid this imminent revolution?
I'm not. Yeah. But I know this is going to disappoint you, but your figures are screwy. We don't spend 60% of our budget. It's much closer to 30% than to 60%. Once again, this is one of those disappointments that I know will make you feel less good. We have a budget of we're spending about $200 billion in our budget this year, of which approximately 60 is going to the military. But the question is, what am I going to do? I'm certainly going to do nothing about it. In the second place, it doesn't seem to me at all that water is worth more than freedom. This is the way you reason it. That is to say, I do know that certain societies, for instance, the French fighting the Nazis during the 40s, made much greater sacrifices, went without much that you're not going without in order to do what they could to free their own country, and therefore I don't resent at all. I would resent very much the expenditure of a single dollar that was unnecessary to spend. But this is something concerning which we can never know. I mean, maybe we got the lousiest Secretary of Defense in American history, or maybe he isn't spending enough. All I say is that I don't believe that this is a sum of money, the expenditure of which we ought to resent. On the contrary, in my own scale of priorities, it is number one. Which reminds me, in the case of the United States versus George Washington Carver, Section 1706.483 of the Federal Code, it was decided that the FBI had no power whatsoever to, quote, put them away. That's his phrase. To arrest people and, quote, put them away. Arrest them, yes, but not put them away. That happens to a thing called a judge and a jury. Now, the FBI arrests people upon some presumptive finding by a judge that that person is guilty and ought to be arrested.
Professor Zinn, could you resist the attempt to denounce the FBI and tell us what you're going to do about the lobbies?
No, I won't resist. Because Mr. Buckley,
Could we please?
yeah.
I'm sorry,
Mr.
we can't continue.
Let me just say to Mr. Buckley really does not understand the judicial process. He has read, I don't know where I guess he reads books or he reads FBI reports. And it doesn't happen that way, that people are put away only by judges and juries after due deliberation. People are put away by police and people are put away by the FBI until such time as they are brought before the court. Sometimes there's an inordinate period of time before they are brought before the court. I didn't. Well, let me just respond very briefly to the second point, which is on the urgent need, priority number one, to spend so much. I think Mr. Buckley's figures are also wrong on the percentage of the armaments in the budget. You have to examine the budget carefully to see what I mean, but not too carefully to understand that. But the point is that he makes this facile analogy with the Free French who are fighting against the Nazis who had invaded their country. The problem is that right now it is the United States that is invading a number of other countries. And what we have been doing for a number of years is to subsidize not the defenses of the United States against an invading force. We have been using $1,000 billion since World War II to subsidize 3,000 military bases all over the world, a CIA, an army and a navy which are everywhere, and to subsidize our attacks and invasions and incursions into other countries' affairs, into Cuba, into Guatemala, into the Dominican Republic, into Vietnam, into Laos, into Cambodia, and into those 33 countries in which we have military bases stationed. So the analogy with the Free French would not be quite as apt as an analogy with those people against whom the Free French were fighting.
A question for Mr. Zinn.
My question is directed to Mr. Zinn. I assume you to be an educated man.
No.
Well, I went to school till the 11th grade, so I just have two small questions I'd like to direct to you. If America is as insidious a country as you claim it is, and you are so paranoid about the FBI, will two of the most salient characteristics of a totalitarian government is you will have mass immigrations, one, and I'm very nervous. And where was I? Yes, where was I? Two of the most salient characteristics of a totalitarian, uptight, screwed up, oppressed country is you'll have mass immigrations, and number two, your intellectuals will be oppressed. They will be repressed. Now, I'd like to ask you if either of these conditions exist in the United States. And I'd like a genuine answer. No rhetoric and bullshit, just honesty, okay?
When you ask for an answer from this platform that has no rhetoric or bullshit, you're asking for a lot. But I'll try. I agree with you that those are two characteristics of totalitarian nations. They're not the only characteristics, and they're not always the characteristics. There are people who stay in countries that have totalitarian tendencies or that have totalitarian aspects simply because life, there are things that are pleasing to them. It's their home. It's their homeland. We have tyrannies all over the world in which people stay because it's very hard to uproot yourself. Some people do. I think that probably more people are leaving the United States today than I don't know what the statistics are, but young people seem to be leaving in larger numbers than they did before. People who feel oppressed by those aspects of the United States which are totalitarian, like the armed forces, like being drafted to fight in war. More and more of those people are leaving the country. But it's true, there certainly is no mass exodus from the United States. As for the repression of intellectuals, keep in mind, I am not claiming that the United States is the totalitarian nation in the sense that nation A, nation B, or nation C is. I think each nation has its own style of being repressive. And the United States has its own peculiar style, which involves having a Bill of Rights, which involves having meetings like this, which involves giving you choices, letting you listen to A or B, except that usually A has more access than B. The President of the United States, Procter & Gamble, and General Motors have more access than the Phoenix or the nonviolent anti-war groups in the United States. As far as academic freedom in the United States, no, I don't, we don't have a wave of academic repression in the United States which can be compared to that in other tyrannical countries. However, we have aspects of it. For instance, radical teachers in universities and in high schools have a very hard time getting jobs and holding jobs. Now, we don't do it as blatantly here as is done in some of the tyrannies in the world. We do it more gracefully. We don't renegotiate contracts. We don't give people tenure. Very often we don't tell them it was for political reasons because we don't like your ideas. The university or the high school says, well, there's no room for you, the budget doesn't allow it. you haven't published enough, or you've published too much, or you've published the wrong things, or you don't fit into the needs of the department. There are 97 different excuses. This is what I mean by a sophisticated society, which has created a defense in depth and handled people and kept things in control in a much more complex way than more clumsy tyrannies in the world.
Mr. Buckley?
Well, Mr. Chairman, my comment on that is that the FBI can't put people away for a long while because they have to be arraigned. And the Supreme Court, in a famous decision in 1961, set free a very prominent rapist because more than 10 hours had gone by since the time he was seized and the time he was arraigned. So once again, I'm here to bring the glad tidings to Mr. Zinn that he is completely wrong.
Question for Mr. Buckley, please.
That's not true. They have been arraigned but not tried. Go ahead.
A question for Mr. Buckley, please.
Oh, yes. Some of us don't like to kill, we don't want to go over to Vietnam and take these flamethrowers and burn down a house and see women and children come out burning. But we have an alternative. We can be thrown in jail and with a bunch of prison-made homosexuals and these 75-year-old buildings, man. I think you know the conditions of the prisons. I think it's really primitive.
Could we have the question, please?
Yeah, it's really primitive to put us in jail for not wanting to kill. Don't you think so? And we've got. How can we change this? Can we do something about this? This really bothers me and a lot of other people.
Well, and it bothered a lot of people many years ago, which is why about 75 years ago, we passed a law allowing for people who are conscientious objectors. You said you didn't want to kill. That law is therefore available to you.
You get a CO, and Melvin Laird is the one that gives us COs. I mean, it's the military that gives us these COs, and they don't give us too many.
I don't know the details of your own case, but I do know any number of lawyers in Boston who will handle it for you free of charge if you have been denied your right under the law to be a conscientious objector.
Professor Zinn?
This is a good illustration of how much redress you have against being killed by the process of reform, which gave us the law of conscientious objection, which has enabled a few people with money and connections and knowledge and education and the wherewithal to appeal and finally get the CO. Difference between the reform, which has allowed this trickle of COs, and something which would go beyond reform. The truth is that the only way that young people have found to deal with the fact that the nation is sending them to die in an ignoble and brutal war in droves is by something more than reform, by rebellion, by leaving, by exile, by resisting, by refusing to fight. More and more young men in Vietnam are simply refusing combat duty. More and more young GIs on army posts are setting up little anti-war groups here and there. That's going beyond reform. When young men go beyond reform and refuse in larger and larger numbers to fight, that's the only way we will solve the question of the leaders of governments sending us to slaughter again and again.
I wish to direct my question to Mr. Zinn, and Mr. Buckley need not reply because it concerns revolutionary tactics, and I don't think that he'll be interested in it.
I just want to make a brief introductory sentence. I don't think it's news to anybody that in the past few months, the campuses have been relatively quiet. There's been no campus activism, as the newspapers care to call it. And, well, personally, I don't feel that this is in any way significant, or this means that the students or the young people or the people in this country don't vehemently feel that there has to be some substantial changes made. I don't think this is any reflection on that at all. I think that perhaps the reason is one of major frustration, a frustration to work within the system and protest, and a frustration to work out of the system because it just leads to arrests and oppression, and it's quite a frustrating experience, as I'm sure you know. I think you just spent some time in jail, in fact. My question is, when you made your introductory talk, you said, or you implied, that it was indeed revolutionary for a group of people to organize, drop out, perhaps join communes and work outside of the system, and in this way, they would be doing their, quote, revolutionary thing. Well, my question is, how do you see a group of individuals who are essentially isolating themselves from the political powers of this country, from the power structure which is oppressing people who haven't the ability, perhaps, to drop out? How do you see these people as being revolutionary? How do you see them provoking any kind of revolutionary changes?
I don't see people as promoting revolutionary changes by getting away from other people. There's no way you can do anything revolutionary by getting away from other people and just being with your own kind. There may be some effect had by some people who do this, but there has to be contact and they have to be visible. And if people are creating a model community or a model way of life for other people, they have to have contact with other people so that what they do is visible, what they do is understandable, and what they do is learned. I think the most revolutionary activity, that is in the sense in which I've defined revolution, consists of being wherever people are, being where people work, being where people study, being where people live, and working with them and finding out what they want and what they need and what's troubling them, and working with them to deal with those things that trouble them, to work with tenants who are being victimized by the power of landlords, to work with people who work in a situation which they find oppressive and alienating and troublesome because of their powerlessness against both the union and the employer, to work with people in a community, for blacks to work in the black community in a situation where working for things as small as a change in the traffic situation, community, change in the police situation, a change in the school situation. These, to me, if they are aimed at ultimately radical changes in a society, if they're aimed at changing people's minds about the way we must live with one another, involve revolutionary activity.
This society is being so railed against tonight. Certainly, of the many charges that were leveled against it by Mr. Zinn, the most serious was that we are a society dedicated to death, which causes me to ask the question, why are we such a society? If in fact I were convinced that it were the case, I would say, no, let's not reform it, let's not revolutionize against it, let's destroy it. Because I think of no other remedy that is appropriate to a society that is dedicated to death. But then I find myself asking, why are we dedicated to death? The nearest thing to reason that Mr. Zinn touched on that particular point was because of high profits of the defense industry. You do remember when he said that that's the reason why so much money goes into defense, because the profits are so high, which causes me to ask, well, how come the shares of the defense industries are almost uniformly selling at about 20% of what they were selling for 2 or 3 years ago? As a matter of fact, the companies in this country that have withstood the stock market depression are, of all things, publishing companies, the people who make books. I'm surprised that it isn't the people who make love flowers that haven't sustained. So it seems to me that it can't be seriously contended that the reason why we are dedicated to death is because we make money from it, especially when you consider that historically big business in America has not wanted war. For instance, General Motors and Henry Ford both said that they would not become an assembly line for war in 1939 and were forced to do so after the Special Acts of 1941. We know that the stock market goes way up, not down, when there is a prospect of peace. So then what is it? Is it that special kind of satanic sadism which we know has at certain times in history actually occupied all of the energy of certain people? Genghis Khan one thinks of, or even Stalin. Well, no. Despise Nixon as you will, but it is simply unrealistic to suppose that he gets his kicks out of administering a machine of death. And if he does, then he is certainly operating under extraordinary self-restraint because, as we know, the weekly casualties have fallen by 80% since he became President of the United States. So what is it that we are therefore engaged in? It seems to me that we are left finally with the following disjunction. Either Mr. Zinn is wrong, that we are not a society dedicated to death, for failure to having given us any kind of cogent evidence to that effect, in which case it is certainly a society whose faults, which we would presumably all join together in identifying, we can proceed to try to do something about, or we must accept it as the kind of society which he, with this extraordinary palette, has painted for us. In which case I say it is especially shocking that in this society there are so few people who have left it or who have revolutionized against it, because if it were that kind of society, we shouldn't dally in a room like this. We should go out doing everything that we could to destroy it. But no, it seems to me that the only acceptable alternative as between those two is that to say that about this country is to say that which is perverse, that which destroys the meaning of words. And words are the only thing we've got left by which to exchange insights, compliments, insults, conciliation, threat, intimidation. Ruin those words and we've got nothing left between us. And it is to do nothing less than to ruin the meaning of the English language to say that this is a country dedicated to death.
We regret, of course, that Mr. Buckley must leave, but our discussion is not through until Mr. Zinn has had the last word.
Mr. Buckley questions whether we are a society dedicated to death if the reason for that is the profit system, and if there's countries and societies which have done away with the profit system and they still have armaments and they still engage in war. And that whole proposition is incomplete. Because it's not only the profit system, it's a system of nation states. You can do away with the profit system. If you still have the system of nation states, you may still have war and you'll still have armament races. You can do away with the profit system and even do away with the nation state. And if you have not somehow created an environment, a society, a community in which people have stopped accepting violence and mass murder, you may still have violence and mass murder. Will take the form of civil war in an international society. My point is that there are multiple reasons for the existence of war and for the fact that the United States is in fact devoted by and large to death. And by that I simply mean that the main thrust of American policy, the main thrust of the American economy, the main thrust of politics in America is towards war, towards armaments, and towards, at this moment, Vietnam, and tomorrow, more adventures elsewhere in the world. If this is so, then we have to look for it in a multiple of reasons. One of them is the profit motive. Another is nationalism, patriotism, the kind of patriotism that leads you always to say, now, we're really not that bad. Look at somebody else. Every nation prides itself that way. We all grew up with those little things that were said to us which we imbibed unquestioningly about how our society is nice and good and the other societies are bad. What's happening now in the world is that people are beginning to grow up, not just here in the United States, but in other countries of the world. And this is a very good thing. Mr. Buckley has great concern for the English language. There's a problem in language and there's a problem in reality. I think Mr. Buckley is right when he says that if things are as bad as we say they are, then we shouldn't be sitting here tonight in this audience merely listening, that we ought to go out. Except that he said, then we ought to go out and destroy everything. No, I think then we ought to go out and resist the state, resist the corporations, resist authoritarianism, and resist profiteering, begin to build new societies, begin to build new communities, and do those things which will be the start of a new world. Thank you.